Welcome to today's live event organized by Sasnet, South Asia Swedish Network at Lund University. I am Amrita Ghosh, and today's panel is titled Kashmir, a Postcolony. Kashmir has been a conflicted space since the partition of 1947, and its eventual events, like the question of plebiscite, has not been resolved 74 years since independence. Kashmir is at present one of the highest militarized zones in the world, if not the highest, as per Forbes, SBS, and a couple of other sources. And there is one soldier for 11 civilians set in Kashmir. A year ago, on 5th August 2019, the Indian government revoked Article 370 that, after the partition of 1947, since 1949, constitutionally signaled Jammu and Kashmir's special provisional status and gave semi-autonomy due to the disputed status of Kashmir. And we would come back to the Article 370 in our conversation. But this revocation came with a total lockdown and a communication siege, during which Kashmiri people were completely cut off from the rest of the world and from mainland India. It has been the longest shutdown in Kashmir. Kashmir before the partition was also not a seamless space, and the Kashmiri Muslims were the hardest hit under the oppressive Hindu Dogra King's regime. The 90s witnessed one of the most disturbing periods, with the Kashmiri Pandits exiled from their homeland. Since then, Kashmir has witnessed years of conflict with continuing violence, pellet guns used on civilians, rape, enforced disappearances. And needless to say, Kashmir is not monolithic. There are multiple voices on different sides of the conflict. But in all of this, Kashmiri people have lived through utmost loss, grief, and a continuous warlike space under brutal conditions. We have with us today a special guest from the University of Pennsylvania, Professor Suvir Kaul, who is joining us to talk about Kashmir, not just what is happening at the present moment, but to trace the events since partition, Article 370, and the recent literature emerging from and on Kashmir, and also his recent book on Kashmir titled Of Gardens and Graves, Essays on Kashmiri Poems in Translation, 2017 by Duke University Press. Professor Kaul was born in Srinagar, Kashmir, and grew up mostly in West Bengal, India. He's an A.M. Rosenthal Professor of English at the University of Pennsylvania. Some of his books are 18th-century British Literature and Postcolonial Studies by Edinburgh University Press, 2009, Poems of Nation, Anthems of Empire, English Verse in the Long 18th Century, Virginia University Press, 2000, which also won the Walkenkower Prize. Thomas Gray and Literary Authority, Ideology and Politics in 18th Century England, Oxford and Stanford University Press, 1992. He has edited The Partitions of Memory, The Afterlife of the Division of India, and co-edited an interdisciplinary volume titled Postcolonial Studies and Beyond, published by Duke University Press and Permanent Black, 2005. Professor Kaul teaches and writes on 18th century British literature and culture, South Asian writing in English and critical theory, including postcolonial studies. He has served as the director of the South Asia Center and as the chair of the English Department, University of Pennsylvania. Thank you so much, Professor Kaul, for joining us today here.
You're more than welcome, Amrita, and thank you very much for inviting me.
I want to begin today with the concept of memory. The whole Kashmir conflict harkens back to a past, and memory works in different ways. Sometimes a collective dominant memory aligns with the national imaginary. At other times, the act of remembering is for voices that are erased. Could you tell us how memory plays a certain role in Kashmir, especially in a space that is besieged? And part two to that, is there also any kind of erasure or destruction of memory for Kashmiri subjects, whether Pandits or Muslims, as the conflict continues?
I think that's a particularly good place to begin a conversation like this. I will, even before we get to the question of memory and its political edges, I will point out that what we are embarked on for the next, as long as it is, 50 or 60 minutes, is very fraught territory. Almost everything I can say can be and is usually contested by other people. I therefore will not claim any more than what I have read and what I have observed as the basis for my observations. Now, this business of memory, if you had asked me before, I'd say 30 years ago, what role memories played in the making of the imaginary, the political imaginary of people in the state, the entire state of Jammu and Kashmir, I would not have had as precise a sense as I do now of the importance of memories, not as individual forms of remembrance, but as those that have been recreated and crafted to enable collectivities to think of themselves in particular ways. That's the other detail that is of great consequence here. Memory is not an individual faculty in these kinds of spaces. Of course, it comes out of individual remembrance. But once it is crafted into a series of historical narratives that actually allow collectivities to reimagine themselves, then you begin to see that the kind of memory space that you are indicating in your question is necessarily fraught because it is the product of contemporary politics. Now, what do I mean by that in practice? In the last 25 years or so, as you know, young Kashmiris have been writing at great length about their sense of why the erstwhile state, the Maharaja state of Jammu and Kashmir, has arrived at the point that it has. Some of these memories, which are obviously not individual, but are resurrected from the historical records, now imagine Kashmir in particular. Now, I want to make one thing clear. Even as we are talking about a state that was a composite of three large divisions, Jammu, Kashmir, and Ladakh, there are smaller entities, but we'll work with these three for a moment. Even as we are talking about this large state, the bulk of what I'm going to say will concentrate on Kashmir. Now, for Kashmiris, especially young Kashmiris, thinking back to their own history, a sharper sense of Kashmiris as being an isolated people who have been at the receiving end of a whole series of invasions that go back to Mughal times. That becomes an operating sense of how they continue to be persecuted by outsiders. So there are the Mughals, there are the Afghans, there are various outside rulers, including the Dogras, after the middle of the 19th century. These are all ways of recreating a history that enables you to come to terms with your highly polarized, very difficult present. Now, the obverse to this for Kashmiris generally, whether they are Hindus or Muslims, Pandits or Muslims or Sikhs, is this sense in which Kashmiris understand themselves to be the project or the product of a syncretic, palimpsestic history in which Buddhists, Muslim preachers of a particular kind, Sufis for the most part, Pandits with their own philosophical and typically Shaivite traditions, all of them created a society that melded together. One that in this kind of palimpsestic, syncretic understanding fell apart under the pressures of politics in the 1990s. So what you also begin to see now, and there are a number of Kashmiri Pandit writers who have been producing work along these lines, is the creation of a sense of a beleaguered, tiny minority community that was forced out of the Kashmir Valley for the most part in 1990, early in 1990, but over the decade more generally, and now have been forced to live without support either from their Muslim majority communities in which they were lived or from the various governments that came to power either in the state or the central government. Now, I know I've taken a little while to go through this, but I wanted to remind you that memory is not an innocent or inert faculty. It is a live way of arranging a community's sense of itself by creating a longer history of self-understanding.
Thank you. And what you said about the syncretic palimpsest of the past, I think I want to bring it to the preface of your own book, Of Garden and Graves. In that preface, you also talk about a composite society before 1990, there's this narrative of Kashmir syncretism in the past that is remembered. But how syncretic has Kashmir been in the past? There's so much written about the syncretic past.
Yeah. But this is a very urgent question for us to come to terms with. And again, I will answer this out of my own sense of my childhood. Every summer, when I went home to my grandparents' homes, both my grandparents lived next to each other, so I would spend almost inevitably every summer, maybe 2 months there. I had no sense, I was young, but I had no sense of some of the political difficulties that actually lay below the surface of Kashmiri lives. Not just the lives of people in Jammu and Ladakh, but particularly of Kashmiri life. Were there these tensions? Absolutely. For instance, I learned only much later when I started doing my reading just how hollow the provisions of electoral democracy had been in practice in Kashmir. Almost from the first election, the National Conference made sure that people were elected unopposed in almost every constituency. This was the case for almost the first 4 elections. And, this is not simply statistical data that you can look up. The government of India has websites which actually tells you how many candidates there were for these elections. It's astonishing. Most of them were National Conference candidates were elected unopposed. Now, it's not only that. B.K. Nehru, who was a Kashmiri Pandit, governor of Kashmir, in his autobiography, he writes about the fact that it was clear to the government of India that this kind of rigged election system served its purposes, because there was always a great nervousness about the idea that the Maharaja Hari Singh had acceded to India under considerable outside pressure, and that his accession did not, in fact, represent the will of the people, which is why the first Indian government, the free government of India, actually acceded at the United Nations to the idea of a plebiscite with one proviso, a very important proviso. They said when the Pakistani forces have withdrawn from the borders of Jammu and Kashmir state, then it will be possible to conduct a plebiscite. Now, that was never going to happen because, as you know, the line of actual control, it has changed because of 3 wars since then. But that was established by January 1948 after the first Indian and Pakistani war settled around Jammu and Kashmir. Those borders, the line of actual control, meant that large tracts of Mirpur province and Poonch, etc., were in fact part of Pakistan, not directly a state of Pakistan, but they are the section, the western section of the state of Jammu and Kashmir that Pakistan thinks of as Azad Jammu and Kashmir, and Indians think of as Pakistan occupied Kashmir. Gilgit and Baltistan, this huge tract of sparsely populated land, they had basically mounted an insurrection of their own even before August 1947 and had virtually become independent. They too exist in a political arrangement with Pakistan where their ties are with that sovereign nation rather than with India. So when, in fact, the Maharaja's Jammu and Kashmir acceded to India, it had already been bifurcated. Since then, if you look at a map, the northeastern part of the state, Indian maps will show you the crown of India, which includes the entire Aksai Chin Peninsula. Well, Aksai Chin has been under Chinese control for the longest time. And the most recent upshot of this was the battle, the unarmed hand-to-hand fighting in the Galwan Peninsula, where the People's Liberation Army of China killed 20 Indian soldiers. That's not a small number. And this was in hand-to-hand fighting. So that tension is still unresolved. So oddly, what we are describing here is a constitutional arrangement that presumes that it has under its purview the entire state of Jammu and Kashmir as it existed under the Maharaja. But it's always been a very truncated section of Jammu, Kashmir, and Ladakh that is now constitutionally part of India. One other detail that is worth mentioning here, one of the reasons for Kashmiri disaffection of the sort that we know to be the case today is that almost all the autonomies guaranteed by the Indian Constitution, including by Article 370, when it was formulated in the late 40s and constitutionally became part of the arrangement that separated the state of Jammu and Kashmir from India, that created a federal relationship within it. A great many of those provisions of autonomy were hollowed out by political processes still then, including ones in which Kashmiris participated. Kashmiri politicians are very much part of the machine that allowed Kashmir to be incorporated more and more into the nation state that is India. But the Supreme Court of India never once actually said, no, this is illegal, because we have constitutional arrangements that actually suggest that India is responsible for 3 or 4 major areas: communications, defense, foreign affairs, etc., finance, but not for the local details of governance. So what I'm describing is a process that began in 48, let's say, and over the next 40 years or so was a strange mix of people in the Kashmir Valley and in the border areas who believed that they were getting enough from India, who believed in the possibility of this kind of constitutional relationship with India, allowing them to stay a part of it. But what happened after January 1990, particularly the brutal military crackdown, has made sure that there is virtually no Kashmiri Muslim, now including the mainstream politicians who always stood for unity with India. Hardly any one of them will openly say that they believe that the future of Kashmir lies in the Indian Union. And this is certainly was the case before what happened in August, on the 5th of August in 2019, and the situation has only worsened since then. There's a sullen calm in Kashmir at this point. It's not as if, of course, there are armed Tehreekis, freedom fighters or terrorists, you choose your term for the moment, who get into fights, gunfights with the Indian army and other security agencies, and they get killed. Look, the Indian firepower is just too strong at this moment, but they're not disappearing. Young people in Kashmir, out of their disenchantment, and sometimes directly as a result of their interactions, their violent interactions with local police, paramilitaries, and securities, are actually continuing to fuel the armed part of the unrest. And as you know, you mentioned this in your introduction, there have been so many massive public protests in the last 20 years. These are now civilians without arms. Yes, the young men and sometimes the young women have stones in their hand, but they are facing people with automatic weapons, pellet guns, tear gas shells, tanks, and trucks, and they won't back down. So even as there is a sullen calm in Kashmir right now, I don't think anybody can read this as a signal that Kashmiris per se have accepted the regime as it exists today.
I want to come back to what you said about the 90s. And it's almost perceived that things were calm till then. And then it led to the faction between the Hindus and Muslims, with the militancy driving out the Kashmiri Pandits. Can you talk to us specifically about this moment of change as it is perceived or understood? And how do we then understand the Pandit exodus, which is still one of the most haunting and mournful events from the 90s?
You know, for this, we have to come up with a longer term understanding, as always. The Maharaja's kingdom was a resolutely Hindu kingdom, by which I mean almost all the senior administrative positions in his state were held by Hindus. There were virtually no Muslims in any of the significant positions in the administration. Muslims were, especially Kashmiri Muslims, but this is also true of the border areas and of Jammu. Muslims were usually peasants, very poor peasants, who were treated in the way that feudal rulers always treated peasants, very badly. Now, where did Kashmiri Pandits fit into this equation? The first is that they, as a small community, had taken to education, first in Persian and then in English, much sooner. There is a complex sociology to this that we don't have to go into, but they had taken to that kind of education much sooner than their Muslim compatriots, which meant that they occupied a disproportionate number of state positions, both in administration, in land revenue management and extraction, in education. Education was sketchily available, but what was available was dominated by this tiny community of Kashmiri Pandits. Now, they too were deeply unhappy at times, even as they enjoyed the fruits of Hindu rule, the Maharaja's Hindu rule. They too were deeply unhappy with the fact that senior administrator after senior administrator employed by the Dogra Maharajas were Punjabi Hindus or Bengali Hindus or Hindus from outside of the state. So, in fact, one of the ironies of this historical situation is that Kashmiri Pandits very early on agitated against the idea that the Maharaja should be importing senior administrators and trained professionals to come and work in Kashmir. The state subject definition came out of a Pandit protest that said, what about us? By which they meant, what about the erstwhile citizens of Jammu and Kashmir state? Why are you bringing in all these outsiders? Because they felt their own capacity to govern and to teach and to administer threatened by the influx of non-citizens of the state, non-subjects of the state. Now, I go back to this long history to remind us that for a tiny minority, even as Pandits lived as the heart and soul of the communities to which they belonged, there was always a disproportion between them and the large mass of Muslims who lacked education, who lacked access to education, who were basically artisans, a great many of them, and especially the Shia population, and workers of the land, literally workers of the land. Even when they owned land, it was tiny patches. The largest landowners were either Dogras or in some cases Pandits, and of course, a few Muslims. Now, this meant that when education began to become available to Kashmiri Muslims, and the first really well-educated young Muslims who went to places like Aligarh, for instance, for their education, or went outside of Kashmir for their education, this includes Sheikh Abdullah, when they came back, they began to recognize that the first thing they had to do was to push the Dogra administration to grant them the kinds of educational facilities that had not been made available. This meant that theirs was a political consciousness that said, we are by numerically, at least in the Kashmir area and the border areas, by far the majority, and we have access to very little. So that's where some of the tensions come in. So once they start staking their claims, especially once India becomes independent of the British and Maharaja Hari Singh's rule evaporates literally overnight, then the government starts putting into place mechanisms that are designed to allow Muslims access to the fruits of power and of being the majority. Now, that is one of the sources of the tension that begins to develop between Muslims and Pandits. That's the structural tension, which is not to say even for a moment, and this I'm willing to say, I lived that life, okay, only for the summers, but I know that there was none of this overt hostility. Stray occasions when this hostility surfaced, absolutely. You know, there are classic instances, a Hindu girl, a young woman falls in love with a Muslim man, they get married, there's an uproar about it. You know, these kinds of flashpoints of tension can now be turned to, and we can be told, oh, look, they never lived happily together. But these were flashpoints of tension. There is no, as you know, there is no society or culture anywhere in the world that lives with a degree of equanimity where nothing happens that roils the waters. Of course, it roils the waters every now and then, but for the most part, people lived well. And then, of course, came, and this is a moment of pause for the history of contemporary Kashmir, then came the elections of 1988, which were so heavily rigged. And they were rigged for a particular purpose. It is very possible that a group of political people, including some young people who had become part of the electoral process for the first time, style the Muslim United Front, it's very possible that they would have come to power. Now, the Indian government distrusted them completely, and Kashmiri elites, including Kashmiri Muslim elites, distrusted them because a great number of them were not from elite families, and because some of them had pro-Pakistani sympathies. Now, at that point, I'm not sure independence was an idea in their heads, although, all the way from the 60s, there had been small groups of people advocating independence. But the 88 elections were so rigged that these people, the members of the Muslim United Front, were literally picked up from the voting booths and jailed, and kept in jail for a while after. And basically, this was an exercise in the Indian government's exercising its power. Now, what happens after that is the prelude. A great many of them, actually, once they're released from jail, they go underground and go away. Right now, the chief of the Hizbul Mujahideen, Syed Salahuddin, that's his nom de guerre, he was actually a candidate in one of those elections. I mention all these brief details just to give you a sense that here was an occasion for electoral democracy to be allowed to function. Let the MUF come to power if they are the popular front. Then you deal with them politically in the way that you dealt with political figures all this while. That wasn't allowed to happen. And that's what led to, and of course, Pakistan had no difficulty in, they've always been smarting from this perceived slight that Indira Gandhi took East Pakistan and made it Bangladesh. That's a terrible way to think about it, because the liberation or the independence of Bangladesh is its own history. But there's always been this sense that India played a role in dismembering Pakistan. So it's Pakistan's moral and indeed political obligation to do what it can to help people who might, either as fellow Muslims or as fellow Kashmiris, members of the citizens of the state subjects of the erstwhile state of Jammu and Kashmir, speak for themselves. So Pakistan started to play an important role in the process, which led to these fierce gun battles between militants and the Indian security forces in 1989 and through the decade of the 1990s, etc. There was also one other detail, this is how international politics works. There was a sense in which people looked at Afghanistan and said to themselves, look, the Mujahideen there, who look like nothing on earth, straggly fighters with old weapons, sometimes with AK-47s or newer weapons. They managed to get the Soviet Union to back out of course, they had the United States backing them militarily and in terms, but that sense that Kashmiris might be able to do what the Afghans had managed to do, I think also motivated young people to say, we need to make this land our own. We are the majority. This is a state system that doesn't respect our desires and aspirations, so we must make it our own. And that's what led to where we were, which is the events of 1989, 1990, the violent decade of the 90s and after.
I want to go back to something you said about the education under Maharaja Hari Singh. And you mentioned that Muslims lacked access to education, and they were either artisans or workers of the land. And clearly the plight of the Kashmiri Muslims were definitely much more oppressive than the Kashmiri Pandits. And I have briefly talked about this before with you. I'm a literary scholar, and I was interested in the new literature coming out. And there's this particular work by Rosie Thomas called The Kashmir Shawl. And it is interesting in a way. It's set in the present moment and also goes back to colonial Kashmir before the partition. And time and again, it refers to education not available to the Kashmiri Muslim children. And of course, the justification there is that that's why the Christian missionary movement is needed. And the novel is set in that kind of space of Christian missionary movement coming into Kashmir. But could you tell us a little more about the education? Because as I started reading on the education during the time, it seems that there were these pathshalas or tolls or madrasas that were freely available. So how was education set up that impacted Kashmiri Muslim children or the Pandit children during that time?
I'm glad you brought up the fact that we're not talking about the absence of education, because students were given talim in their religious traditions, both amongst Muslims, of course, and this is largely male students we are talking about. A few young girls were also educated, but rarely. We're talking about the late 19th century or the early 20th century, but secular education, the kind that modernizes you in a way that allows you to participate in the apparatus of governance and in the forms of civil society as they took shape from the 1930s onwards. That was available to very few people because the state was not particularly interested in endowing educational or creating educational institutions. That is the Dogra state. I think, now I can't remember, it's either the historian Mridu Rai or the historian Chitralekha Zucchi, who have pointed out that not Hari Singh, but his father had no difficulty in endowing colleges in Punjab, but would not do the same in his own state of Jammu and Kashmir. So tertiary education was barely existent, but even modernizing, and I'm putting quotation marks around that term, but a kind of secular competence in the apparatus or in the languages of the state and of education as they existed, particularly in English, was late to come to Kashmir. And here, the CMS school, there's a very good reason why the missionaries couldn't get into Kashmir for the longest time, because remember that the British the British mandate didn't hold exactly the same way all across the subcontinent. When they had treaty relationships with Maharajas like the Dogra lineage, they put in a resident at court, and that resident had considerable powers, an Englishman. But for the most part, local governance was left to the local ruler and all the people he appointed. Now, this is important to education also. So when you have an Englishman in the later 19th century saying Muslim children are not being educated, he's right. And this is one more way in which the British want to get to establish their footprint in larger sectors of the civil society from which they are legally banned. So when the Christian Missionary Society, the CMS, when they came to Srinagar, they were first allowed to open a tiny little school in Srinagar, and which I think, if I remember the history, and it's not something I worked on specifically, it was a very rocky opening. A few pundits, maybe, and even a smaller handful of Muslim students joined, and that there was always a great deal of suspicion about education like that. So it took quite a while, I think 20 or 30 years, before the CMS school, which was variously called, the flagship was called Hedo Memorial after a treasurer, or CMS Bisco School after Tyndale Bisco, who was one of the stalwarts of missionary education in Kashmir. So it took a while, but they began to exist in Srinagar. And this is a Srinagar-centric story for the most part, which meant that Kashmiri elites began to have school-level access to English and the kinds of values that were seen to be common amongst Indian feudal elites and the British imperial elite. You know, the young men were being taught how to swim in the Dal, how to perform in regattas on the Dal, how to go on hikes. All of this way is this educational apparatus is important to because this is the moment at which a new Kashmiri elite is being produced. Again, still disproportionately Pandit, but increasingly staffed by the Muslim children of parents who wanted their children to be able to grow into the kinds of positions that the state could offer. So by the 30s, you certainly have a very large and visible and politically self-aware group of Kashmiri male lawyers in particular, who are now arguing that they are the leaders of their community, and this community needs a larger share of all that is available within the state. And that's this is an interesting, ironic little detail. something called what was it called? Now I just blanked out on the title, but it was basically called the Kashmir Reading Room, I think. This was a group of young Kashmiri Muslims, for the most part, who met to discuss politics, but they couldn't think of themselves as a political party because that kind of political organization was banned by the Maharaja. So they styled themselves a reading room party. They would meet in order to discuss books and ideas. And that is the transition from education into political self-awareness and political mobilization. And that, I think, is very much a feature of Srinagar-based life, certainly in the 30s onward. So yes, the missionaries did a great deal for Kashmiris and their education, but their beginnings are very much part and parcel of the imperial desire to be able to cultivate the kinds of subjects who would see the British as naturally their masters, because they were the ones who intervened in situations of great plight in order to allow young people to be better off than they were before.
My next question comes back to the title of today's event, Kashmir, a Postcolony. And I thought about it because a couple of years ago, I was at this workshop on conflict zones broadly and mentioned Kashmir as a post-colonial conflict zone. And that got a lot of curiosity that why am I even calling it a post-colonial conflict zone? What is so post-colonial about it? And of course, there's different ways to respond to the ideas of post-coloniality right now. But the larger question about how do we understand spaces of exception like Kashmir within the arc of post-colonial nation states? Is there a need to rethink how we articulate or the taxonomy that we use for conflict zones like Kashmir?
Yeah, I was intrigued by that term, but I think I understand what makes you use a term like that, or what makes other people use it. Look, in my book, I have a chapter which is titled Indian Empire, the Case of Kashmir. Now, I did this as for its shock value as much for its diagnostic value. Because one of the features of post-colonial state formation and governance, now this is something we think that the term post-colonial means that the transition between the imperial state, the colonizing state, and the post-colonial state, the independent democratic state, the secular republican democratic state, is a smooth and easy transition. How can it be? It cannot be, because democracy is always a project in the making. And certainly you can see why there are many backslides in democratic functioning, as in the case of the present government. But this is not the first government that has decided to try and throttle some of the freedoms that the terms republican governance or democracy actually allow us to conceive of. But even more than political practices, India inherited, and Pakistan to be sure, India inherited the laws, the administrative structures, the land revenue, and administrative models that were put into place by the British Raj, and did nothing to change them, which meant that some of the features of the imperial state that insisted on a hierarchy of governance, that there were subjects in the state and then there were their governors, those stayed in place structurally. We never made those changes. Some of our absurd laws are still on the books 70 odd years after independence because the British put them into place. You know, the Armed Forces Special Powers Act, for instance, is a reworking of a police act that Lord Linlithgow initiated in order to be able to authorize the army and the police to act against Gandhi and the anti-colonial marchers that Mahatma Gandhi had gathered around him. Now, any right-thinking post-colonial politician should say that's the first thing we have to get rid of. That institutional apparatus, that legal apparatus, that governance apparatus. Now, that's one. So, was India ever postcolonial as a finished exercise in aspiration and achievement? No, it's an ongoing process. But there's something crucial here, which is, remember that the British government dealt with so many peoples at the peripheries of the subcontinent, but also internally via treaty relations. Of course, they were the paramount authority from Queen Victoria onwards, but there were all kinds of treaty relationships with 500 odd different principalities, kingdoms, etc., some very small, some larger. But they also established treaty relationships, very uneasy treaty relationships, with so many of the peoples of, say, the northeast of India, the lands between, say, Bengal, Bihar, northwest of that and northeast of that, going into Burma, then Burma, now Myanmar. Now, all of these are, we could think of them as exercises in canny colonial governance. You don't want to have to take on the Nagas by insisting that they have to obey the constitutional arrangements that, let's say, parts of Delhi exercise, that is the British Delhi over Uttar Pradesh. So the British, I'm doing this in a haphazard way, but the idea is to remind you that the colonial rule, oddly, had a great many internally differentiated ways of dealing with peoples at the core and at the periphery. Now here comes 1947, and overnight the British decide that you have either two options. You are either part of Pakistan or you're part of India. Now, a great many people had never identified with either state because they didn't exist. They didn't identify as, think of all the peoples of Nagaland, Manipur, Mizoram, all the states where there's been a long-term insurgency. In fact, some people have argued correctly, I think, that what the Indian state has been doing in Kashmir, they actually learned how to do this in Mizoram, in Manipur, and in Nagaland. That's what they started doing there in the 40s and 50s while they were working out different relationships with Kashmiri. So the post-colony in the Indian case resulted in a desire to be able to define as sharply as possible the frontiers of the nation. So it wasn't possible to conceive of, and this is true even of Nehru, the great Democrat, it wasn't really possible to think of imaginatively of arrangements made with people who manifestly did not identify with the new post-colonial Indian state and the Indian nation. I'll mention one other detail. We, for the most part, like to believe that, yes, the Indian National Congress, led by Mahatma Gandhi, led by Nehru and other political figures all across the country, while they were fighting the British, Kashmiris were fighting the Maharaja. They were not fighting the British. There was a movement to get rid of the Maharaja. So, did they draw inspiration from the anti-colonial movement in India? Yes. Were they identical with the anti-colonial movement in India? No, because they were not technically fighting the British. They were fighting the Maharaja. So to say that now that the Maharaja has gone and has overnight acceded to India in fear of his life and rule, and the Indian troops have flown in, this has settled the question forever, is to misread that crucial moment in history.
I want to stay with the idea of the post-colony a little more. And I'm thinking of the post-colony with Ashil Membe's idea of the post-colony with this whole obscene, grotesque forms of domination and subjection. And you yourself, in one of your earlier articles on Kashmir, the title was, I think, To Walk Past the Threatening Gaze. You mentioned the violence in Kashmir. And there was a phrase that mentioned when violence is not visible. Could you explain that in the context of how you understand violence in Kashmir, the invisibility of it, when, of course, very visible violence is stark and present in everyday life?
Absolutely. Look, I think I should begin by saying when my family went back to Srinagar, to our ancestral home, which luckily was safe, it was damaged, but only marginally so. Nothing major had happened. It was safe. We went back in 2003, and everybody, all our neighbors told us, oh, things are so much better. And there was a real sense of hope in the air. The gardens were open, people were picnicking for the first time in over a decade. Children had grown up without leaving their neighborhood for the entire decades of the 1990s, because it was so scary, all that was happening there, the kind of the eruptions of violence between militants and the police or the CRPF. So we go back in 2003, and everyone tells us, "Oh, yeah, we're glad to see you back. It's so much better now. Things are getting better." And we walk around the streets of Srinagar, and I think this is what it means for things to be getting better. I do not exaggerate this. There were massive bunkers at every one of the major street crossings. To leave my neighborhood, which is a tiny little neighborhood, to leave there are three roads actually, to go to different parts of the city. Each one because of a bridge, one because of the telephone exchange, one because of the colleges, had these bunkers there, heavily armed bunkers with the CRPF at that point inside, peering at you as you walk past. Not only that, literally every 150 meters, 100 meters, there was a SLR, self-loading rifles, automatic rifles, carrying CRPF man everywhere you walked in Srinagar. And if you grow up in Delhi, or as I did in Bengal, you're not used to this at all. The only time I've seen something like this happening is when I traveled in Punjab in the 80s, where you couldn't go anywhere. And some of this came back to Delhi because they were, I was much younger then, my beard was heavier, it was darker. I would get, and I'm a fairly large person, I'd get stopped even in Delhi because I could be a Sikh and thus a potential terrorist in the eyes of the Indian state. I had seen this kind of surveillance in Punjab, but nowhere else. And I thought, this is the stuff of everyday life in Kashmir, and my neighbors are telling me everything is better. This is not democracy. You cannot have a functional democracy when each time you step across outside your house, you know that there are these weaponized eyes following you wherever you go. Of course, we were better off. The moment we got there, all the CRPF pickets knew that we were a Hindu family. My mother always wore a sari. My sister always wore a sari. We would walk on the streets. I'd be walking with them. I could look Kashmiri Muslim, of course. But they knew I was Hindu because I was walking with these two sari-clad women. Saris had disappeared from Srinagar. And that is also, it's not a comfortable burden. You don't want to be thinking I'm protected because these guys know I'm a Hindu. They don't care that I'm a Kashmiri, but they know I'm a Pandit, and that's good enough for them. And that's my sense of what it means to constantly live a life where not just the episodes of violence that implicate you directly, but that you're living a life when you walk past this kind of militarized surveillance at all times. That's been Kashmiri lives for 30 years now.
Let's turn to the last one very disturbing year since the revocation of Article 370. And we've been seeing debates and wide mainstream support for the revocation. And yet, once again, the history of the Article 370 and why it was important has kind of faded. So much has been written about it, but it would be helpful if you could talk about the history of the article itself and Kashmir's ascension to India in 1947. Eventually, 2019's blackout, the total communication blackout. Was this particular blackout also any different from previous communication sieges that have happened in Kashmir time and again? So again, a little two-part question to you.
I've touched upon this already, so I won't repeat what I've said before, but we have to understand that this is a constitutional arrangement. The framers of the Indian Constitution were fully aware that the history of the accession is fraught and needs to be respected, needs to be marked by a special constitutional arrangement. That's Article 370. But it's also crucial to remember, and we are happy to forget this. Indians like me are happy to forget this. It is crucial to remember that Jammu and Kashmir was not the only state with a specified constitutional arrangement with India. There are at least 10 other states or parts of states. If you look at Articles 370 and 371, you will see that there is a modicum of federalism that guides the relationship between the Indian center and that is Delhi and different states. So Kashmir is not to that extent an exception. Even this week, you will probably have read that the Nagas have insisted, and this government, this Narendra Modi-led government, seems to be happy to go along with the fact that when a Nagaland peace arrangement is worked out, Nagas will have their own flag and will have arrangements that will respect not sovereignty. They won't have sovereignty, but a degree of autonomy. But that's what Article 370 enshrined. It said that Jammu and Kashmir would have something called the Sadri Riyasat, which is the equivalent of the Urdu equivalent of a prime minister, not a chief minister. Now, there's that history. And then there is the history, even going back to 1948, of groups like the Praja Parishad, which were one of the forerunners, or at least the allies of the BJP, who said we cannot possibly imagine an arrangement with India that allows there to be a separate national flag for Jammu and Kashmir, a separate prime minister for Jammu and Kashmir. And so they insisted right from that moment on a more or less complete assimilation or incorporation of Jammu and Kashmir into India. So what happened on the 5th of August 2019 is for the BJP the endpoint of a long and announced. They didn't do anything that was surprising. They've been saying that we believe in something, or at least the Sangh Parivar believes in something called Akhand Bharat. And Akhand Bharat means that there ought to be no difference in the way Jammu and Kashmir exists vis-a-vis the state, and say Haryana exists vis-a-vis the state. It should all be identical. Now, this is a contravention of the Constitution. Of course, what this reminds us is that you can use democratic processes like parliamentary majorities to do fundamentally undemocratic, and I would argue unconstitutional activities. But then we are supposed to have a Supreme Court that will intervene in such more matters and say you can't do this because this is manifestly unconstitutional. But the Supreme Court will not act. They find ways of either not acting or ignoring the problem, or actually coming up with judgments that respect the right of the centralizing state to override these kinds of constitutional arrangements. So that is a sort of general history of 370. But the last thing I will say is what happened then in 2019, particularly the internet blockade that you talked about, has been rehearsed for 30 years now. It's the Congress government that did this as much as every one of the governments that came to power locally, whether it was National Conference or PDP, they were all happy to go along with this kind of suspension of civic rights, access to the internet, access to telecommunications every now and then. When they wanted it, they did it. So I'm not going to, even for a second, suggest that the people in political power in Jammu and Kashmir ever properly respected the democratic rights of their citizens. They were happy to collaborate with the Indian government in imposing these kinds of coercive structures of administration. One last detail. These are the people, as you know, this is the difference between August 5, 2019 and what came before. Mehbooba Mufti, ex-chief minister, her father was the home minister of India. This is a very big deal, arrested. Farooq Abdullah and his son, both chief ministers, arrested. Just about every mainstream, it's not only the Hurriyat the people who've been arrested, the people pushing for independence, but just about every mainstream independence, mainstream politician, people who spent political lives arguing in favor of India, all of them were arrested. In which case, who do you have on the ground where you can say, okay, this is a cadre of leaders, or indeed a cadre of followers, who actually believe that Kashmir should be part of India? At this point, I don't know who there is who actually believes that union with India is a good thing.
I want to turn to your current book from 2017 of Garden and Graves. And the next couple of questions are specifically on the book. I'm very interested in the unique merging of poetry and photography interspersed throughout the book. What made you put the two very different mediums to represent contemporary Kashmir? And what do the photographs then offer in the reading of the poems, or vice versa?
I'm going to backtrack just a bit. I began writing this book by really writing for newspapers and magazines in India, saying to my friends, my liberal friends in India, do you know what's been happening in Kashmir? Are you paying attention? Because I didn't know till I actually went back in 2003 about the way things had been. I really didn't. We think we know from newspaper sources, but they were very contained. We knew of some atrocities and killings, Pandit killings, Muslim killings, etc., but I didn't know enough. So I started writing these exercises in long form journalism to try and educate basically my friends and everybody else who's interested about what is happening in Kashmir. Then I thought, this is not getting me anywhere because nothing changes in Kashmir. That was 2003. The book only came out in 2015. So I said, nothing changes. I'm going to write report after report every year arguing the same thing. That doesn't make sense. So I decided I'm really a scholar of poetry. I've written a great deal about English poetry or poetry in English. And I decided to start collecting poems that have been written largely in Kashmiri. There's only one Urdu poem that I comment on in this book, but I wanted to curate a collection of poems written by both Pandits and Muslims in the conflict years, because I am convinced that the archive of poetry can provide, if you learn how to read it properly, access to a reservoir of affective but political feelings that will inform us about the conditions under which people actually live, not necessarily their political life, but the way in which they experience life. I'd also noticed that when you're talking to a Kashmiri who actually lives in Kashmir and you talk to them about what they've been facing on the street, almost inevitably the conversation would trail off. And they wouldn't complete a sentence and they'd come up with a phrase from a poem or a couplet from a poem. And I began to recognize that poetry in a conflict zone becomes a way in which people communicate a sense of collective and shared empathy, suffering, resistance to each other. This is true as much of Pandits as it is of Muslims. So we collected and I tried to translate a great many of these poems in collaboration with a young man, Nasir Hussain in Kashmir. And we finally, I think the book contains 27 poems, as many Hindu poems by Hindus and poems by Muslims. And that was my way of saying, I will show you how a literary archive can give you a sense of people's lived experiences. And that's essentially what I was doing. So I go to this publisher in Delhi and I show him 2 or 3 pictures that a friend of mine, Javed Dar, who's this photojournalist, a brilliant photojournalist, he has taken. I said, I want these for the cover. And I have a great many pictures on my computer. So this publisher says to me, but let me see, these are wonderful pictures, let me see more. And I start flicking through on my computer all the pictures Javed has shown me or given me. And my publisher says, you cannot publish a book with just a picture on the cover. These pictures have to be in the book too. And I instantly recognized what he was saying, that these pictures are also a very powerful record of human experience in a conflict zone. Equal parts politics, equal parts emotions, equal parts suffering, equal parts resistance. And so they were in a counterpoint with my analysis of poetry and my other essays. And that's how this book came about, with the fact that you often have a poem and a photograph facing it. They're not necessarily comments on each other, but they are all creative products of the same situation. I'll say one other detail. Even if I was in Kashmir, sometimes weeks could go by when we couldn't leave home because there'd be a curfew, there'd be some problem, and my home is near a neighborhood called Masuma, which is a politically very active and reactive neighborhood. So there was constantly tear gassing and curfewing there, so you couldn't go out. But Javed, as a photojournalist, was always out there taking pictures. So in many ways, for me, he was also my eyes and my insight into what was actually happening on the street. I can hear about it the next day. I can go and look there once the curfew lifts, but I can't be there. But he was there in his flak jacket and his helmet and his cameras, sometimes getting beaten or doing whatever else he had to do to get these pictures. So the role of photojournalists in documenting the Kashmir experience of the last 30 years is incalculable. not only documenting, but also making it available for anybody who wants to see. And they don't simply go and show you a bad policeman shooting. Of course, there is that, or a bad militant doing something or the other. They show you what happens in the crossfire. They show you how people get caught up, but also how people mobilize in pursuit of their political aspirations.
The next question you've already partly answered, and I was interested in how does poetry have this rich archive of the feelings and desires, and you really went through it. But I'm interested in when you mentioned the poets are Kashmiri Muslims as well as Kashmiri Pandits. Is there a difference in their voices in representing Kashmir and their struggles?
There's bound to be, in the sense that there's so much loss in both. These are the similarities. These are poems of loss. Pandits mourning their homeland. Muslims mourning both the conflict, but also the loss sometimes of their Pandit brethren and the loss of the cultures they had all grown up in. You know, one of the tragedies, I mean, we don't talk about it in these terms, is that you now have basically almost 2 generations of Kashmiri Muslims who have grown up without Kashmiri Pandits in their midst. They have no working memories of shared lives. I do, even though I didn't grow up there. My generation and before this, you knew what it meant to live next door to each other and to share lives. That has disappeared. But that sense of something evaporating, disappearing in the worst possible way is shared by Pandits and by Muslims. One in exile for the most part, in displacement. One mourning loss even as they are home. So that's what is shared. And the Pandit poems that I translated, there were a great many more that are obviously not in this book. They are all about longing. We want to go back. Will we ever be able to go back? Or this sense, what happened? We were brothers once. We were sisters once. What changed? The garden, this is a typical metaphor. The garden is the same. What kinds of winds blew through that it no longer can contain both of us? So there is a great deal of that in this kind of work. Now, that is obviously an existential, experiential, affective, emotional experience that is specific to Pandits. For the Muslims, there is this sense of, you know, what happened to us? We were a comparatively peaceful society, and now our children are dying, our sons are being killed. There are poems written by very few more. I should have found more, but poems written by Kashmiri women poets saying, "Where are our children?" You know, and that sense of personal loss also pervades the poetry of conflict produced by Muslims, particularly by those who continue to live in Kashmir, not just in Srinagar, but in the other towns of the valley.
We're reaching the end of our conversation, and I will be taking some questions later. But I want to turn to the new writing in English on Kashmir, and these are by Kashmiri writers living outside Kashmir or within. And interestingly, recently, by English writers, as I mentioned, Rosie Thomas, or Indian writers from various parts of India. There is certainly a rich multiplicity of voices on Kashmir. And yet one can argue that Kashmiri people should be talking and writing about Kashmir. What do you think about this growing body of cultural productions on Kashmir in bearing witness to what's happening? And how do these fictionalized representations of Kashmir help us in engaging or rethinking the larger dominant representations of Kashmir? What's at stake when such cultural productions are coming from non-Kashmiri voices also?
Everything is at stake, Amrita. I'm so glad you're calling attention to that. For me, the only sign of hope, and I will say this, the only sign of resistance in Kashmir left when you have a state as strong as India is militarily, is this huge cultural production. It's not only novels, it's poetry. Good or bad is not the point. It's poetry. It's documentary film. It's songs. The number of wonderful rappers that have emerged out of Kashmir. I've written on one of them in my book. He was the earliest of them and possibly still the best known, MC Cash. But artwork, you know, there are so many artists and the work of political cartoonists, but also of what producers of what used to be called comics and are now called graphic novels. Malik Sajad's Munu, for instance. I mean, there is a huge variety of cultural expression. Songs, both satiric songs, but music of loss, longing, desire, produced by Kashmiris. There's a huge archive now being created, which, if nothing else, will be the archive that will resist any kind of forgetfulness. Remember that a state, not only through its footprint on the ground, it tries and controls, and I'm back to the beginning of our conversation, memory. It tries to control cultural records. It tries to shape self-understanding in a particular way. Well, now you have an enormous number of Kashmiris, both writing within Kashmir, but also Kashmiris now settled elsewhere, who are writing along these lines. My own book is a small contribution to that kind of oeuvre of writing. But we also have a novelist like Madhuri Vijay, who's not Kashmiri, deciding to set her novel in Kashmir because in her understanding, something connects tensions in domestic life and social life in Bangalore to what is happening in Kishtwar. Now, when that begins to happen, and it's not opportunistic in her case, I suspect your Rosie Thomas, this is an opportunistic location. Give me a pretty locale, give me impoverished peoples, has been a story of English success. Somebody like Madhuri Vijay or other writers from the mainstream, that is India, are looking at Kashmir and recognizing that it represents an enormous challenge to all the cultural and political and democratic values they believe in. What is at stake in Kashmir? And many Kashmiris think that I shouldn't be bringing in Kashmir in the context of Indian democracy. What's happening in Kashmir is about Kashmir, not about Indian democracy. But for me, these are simultaneous processes. When India becomes democratic, Kashmir will achieve self-determination. When Kashmir achieves self-determination, India will be democratic. Not just India. Without international attention of a fundamentally democratic sort, an attention committed not to real politics, but to democratic politics, that's the moment at which we might see some tentative steps towards the resolution of this, what seems to be by now a hugely violent, indeed intractable problem.
I'm interested that you mentioned Madhuri Vijay because I think the novel that you mentioned is The Far Field. And as opposed to somebody like Rosie Thomas, who got the best epic romance of the year for the Kashmir Shawl. So I think your point is very well taken there. I want to end the conversation with the pressing, because of everything that we've spoken. Every time we talk about Kashmir, we talk about the unfinished partition, or as it is often called, an unfinished agenda of partition. But is it really fair to limit Kashmir in that kind of phrasing? Because it seems that there's so much more to than just what happened during or after the partition.
Yeah. See, to think about partition is to think primarily in terms of British India and then the bilateral relations between India and Pakistan. And Kashmiris no longer think of themselves as pawns caught up in that particular triangle. Yes, what happened in 1947 and 48 is completely crucial to the formation of the problem of Jammu and Kashmir. But is that the only history that we should be considering? Not at all. In the same way as we imagine that what happened on the 5th of August 2019 is an extension of many processes that had been put into place before that, what happened in 1947-48 was an extension of processes that are much longer in their development.
Thank you so much, Professor Kaul, for being with us today.
Thank you for having me, Amrita. This was an energizing conversation, and I hope one that you had intended it to be.
Yes, it was absolutely that and more. Thank you to the viewers also for being here.